Listeners, just a quick reminder before we get going that if you are a regular consumer of this podcast, you will love The Week magazine, your weekly digest of the best news, reviews and columns from more than 200 UK and international sources. Multiple perspectives and a unique overview of the most important topics and the most entertaining stories. And just for listening to this show, you can get your first 12 issues for just £12 and a free Moleskine notebook. Go to theweek.co.uk/offer and enter the promo code POD12. That's theweek.co.uk/offer and the promo code POD12. And now, on with the show. It's the week ending Saturday, the 25th of January, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Prince Charles address the World Economic Forum in Davos, Harvey Weinstein's trial beginning in New York, and the passing of Monty Python's Terry Jones, aged 77. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Ollie Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team is Arian McNichol and Gabriel Power, and from sister site theweek.com, Jess Hullinger. Gabriel, you're up first. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Is the war on drugs heating up in Mexico?
In much of Mexico, insecurity is rooted in the splintering of drug cartels who fight over control of territory. That violence, however, frequently spills into the community.
We're walking along the boardwalk in Coatzacoalcos, Veracruz, a part of town that would normally be full of people enjoying the beach and the sun. As you can see, there's hardly anyone here. Afraid of becoming the next victims of extortion or kidnapping or murder, many have chosen to leave. Manuel Rapalo, Al Jazeera, Coatzacoalcos, Veracruz.
A clip from Al Jazeera's YouTube channel. Gabriel, what's happening in Mexico, apart from American reporters walking around?
Statistics this week revealed that 2019 was the most violent year on record in Mexico, with an astonishing 34,582 people murdered in just 12 months, or around 95 people every single day.
Okay. Are those historically high stats then?
They are. I mean, while violent crime fueled by cartel activity in Mexico is no great surprise, and records only began in 1997.
Yeah, I mean, synonymous, you'd say, really, right?
Yeah, it's still the highest ever recorded, and an increase on last year, which was the previous record.
And that's particularly noteworthy, isn't it, because of what the current Mexican president said. So when he was standing for election, he pledged to pacify the country with a less confrontational approach to security. What did that mean, and what's actually happened? What's gone wrong?
He was elected in December 2018, and it's been just over a year. And there is an argument that could be made that says that he has pacified violence somewhat because the increase year on year is actually much smaller. It's only about 2% or 2.5% compared to increases that we were getting in previous years of like 17, 18, 20%.
Okay, so I mean, that's a statistic he might want to put on the front of his manifesto.
No, exactly. It's not a storming victory, but
not as bad as the headlines might seem.
No, exactly. It's also so one of the things that he did, and one of the things that I think has led to a continued rise, is the fact that he created a National Guard with more than 70,000 members in Mexico. But then all the kind of panic in America over migrant caravans and all that sort of stuff meant that a lot of them were forced to be relocated to the border, and thus couldn't help in the cartel kind of war, in the drug war, which has been waging since 2006.
And Jess, this isn't just a Mexican issue, is it? We're talking there about the Mexican border with the USA. I mean, the drugs basically go to the USA, don't they? So what responsibility does the US have for this?
The responsibility is large in the US. I mean, Mexican drug cartels take in some $20 billion annually from US drug sales. So it's being fueled by use in the US. One of the things that I think is interesting, as well as this argument that some people have made, that the answer is for the US to just flat out decriminalize illegal drugs. One of the writers on theweek.com, Ryan Cooper, made this argument, and he said Central America is the biggest conduit for cocaine coming through growers in South America to customers in the U.S., and that actually if we take the money out of the drugs, so if we stop them being illegal and actually allow people to use them legally, it would take them off the black market and decrease their value and take the violence out of it potentially.
But I mean, that's literally never going to happen, is it?
No,
I mean, even Bernie Sanders does not have that policy.
There's basically no chance of that at all. But I think it's an interesting argument. But again, I think the question is like, what's the middle ground? How do we solve this problem? Obviously, taking a sort of a lighter approach to it, trying to be less confrontational, is admirable, but it clearly hasn't worked.
And Arian, one of the ways that the US is now dealing with this is cooperating more fully with Mexico rather than just, pointing at them from a lectern and saying they've got a problem.
The US war on drugs stretches all the way back to Nixon. Since then, this internal prohibition that's going on in the US of drugs that now some people are saying is the sort of root cause of the problem was the reason why Nixon and then every president since has waged war in this really sort of aggressive way that with massive amounts of co-funding between whichever Latin American country is the current culprit and the US. And previously it was Colombia, of course. But in having sort of tried to solve the problem in Colombia and chopped off the heads of the cartels there, the problem then spread elsewhere. And that's when the problem moved to Mexico. And that's why in about 2006, 2007, this collaboration began between the US and Mexico to try to deal with the issue there. And it equally has been ineffective in both places.
And Gabriel, this has intensified recently at a political level.
Yeah, the Mexican officials last week presented lawmakers in the country with a proposal to overhaul the country's criminal justice system. Now, I'm not entirely sure how much difference this is going to make because at present, it looks like, as far as it will extend, is to allow private communications to be used as evidence and limit legal challenges to avoid extradition delays for criminal suspects, many of whom are US bound. And I suppose they're going to work more closely with US authorities on that. But that kind of speaks to López Obrador, the current Mexican president's kind of slightly mixed messages on cartel violence, which is that he believes that white-collar crime and corruption is a bigger problem, and that he doesn't want to go for a kingpin strategy like Arian was mentioning, where they'd go and decapitate or kill the head of a cartel. It just seems his whole approach to everything seems very vague and mixed and unclear.
It sounds to me like what he wants to do is, instead of attacking the problem head on, he wants to sort of try and stop the cycle. So part of the problem is that the cartels have corrupted government and police departments, and so there's a lack of accountability. So no one thinks that if they're caught, they're going to be in trouble. So it seems like he wants to sort of root out the corruption, and hopefully that will solve the problem. And I think that's part of what this new agreement is, maybe with the U.S. They want to speed up extradition. They want to make it easier to prosecute people. I think that may explain it a little bit.
And do they want Donald Trump to stop talking about the wall so much? I mean, he's got his re-election campaign coming around the corner, hasn't he? If there's an element of cooperation there, maybe they think he'll be slightly softer in terms of the way he talks about their neighbour, Mexico.
I don't think anything is likely to stop Donald Trump talking about the wall as we approach the next election. And Jess, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's so important to him. And even though he hasn't advanced it in his first term, you'd think that it would still feature as something that he intends to get done in the same way that he has attempted to follow through, to his credit if you were into his policies, on several of the other key things that he pledged during the last election. So it was important to him then, and I can't see how it won't be important to him again.
And I think also he wants to appear very strong on what's happening in Mexico and what it means for Americans. And so one of the noteworthy events that happened recently is this Mormon family that I think held dual citizenship, and they were in Mexico, and they were massacred by drug cartels. And
for what? I mean, because a lot of people listening to this would be thinking it's a bit like when people talk about knife gangs here in the UK. It's very sad for the people involved, but it doesn't affect the rest of us because we're not in a gang. Were they involved in any way?
No, essentially they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, I think,
Right.
is what happened, and they were mistaken for being the enemies of these people. And so Donald Trump responded and said, we're just waiting on Mexico to act, and we're just waiting to be called in. And he offered to send in America's military. I think that he's going to continue to try to appear to be very strong on this issue.
And the wall is so symbolic as well, isn't it, for a tough immigration policy generally. So even if he doesn't complete it, he's going to want to talk about it.
But you've chosen this story as your story of the week, Gabriel, because it has implications for the rest of us. What are those implications for listeners to this who aren't in Mexico? I guess it speaks to the popularity of illegal drugs, really.
Yeah, I suppose so. It speaks to the popularity of illegal drugs, and it shows quite how bad the situation is getting. I mean, obviously, I said at the beginning that the rate of increase in murders is dropping slightly. It's gone down to 2%. But the fact that the Mexican drug war is still going and is still so devastatingly violent is just an astonishing thing that I feel like the rest of the world has forgotten. Because even though the numbers might be quite low in terms of per capita or 100,000 of the population, 35,000 deaths or 95 a day over the course of a year is an insane amount. It's unbelievable.
And do we anticipate this trend to reverse at all? Or do we think next year's statistics are going to show even more murders in Mexico?
I can't imagine how it will reverse, and particularly being fueled as it is by America's ongoing opioid crisis, which is a whole other issue. But, demand in the US for heroin in particular has been going up, and cocaine is stable. It's still one of the world's biggest drug customers. So just in terms of demand, they're going to need to get their drugs from somewhere. Mexico is the most obvious place, not only because it's a big producer, but also because it's their nearest neighbor. But also the American attitude to the war on drugs has yet to really turn a corner. I don't think that Americans have decided that this isn't working, and so we should pursue some radically different strategy of the kind that Jess said, So it seems like it's an issue that's going to keep going.
Okay. Well, our very own US heroine is Jess. She'll be up next after this. Okay, Jessica, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Is it time to diversify our portfolios or their managers?
My name is Jordan Belfort. The year I turned 26, I made $49 million, which really pissed me off because it was 3 shy of $1 million a week.
We're making a name for ourselves.
Nobody knows if the stock is going to go up, down, sideways, or in circles. You know what a Fugazi is?
Oh, Fugazi. It's fake.
Yeah, Fugazi, Fugazi. It's a wazi, it's a woozy, it's a fairy dust.
The trailer for The Wolf of Wall Street, directed by Martin Scorsese. Jessica, I've been waiting for years for you to serenade me with Jordan Belfort quotes. Your spiritual guru, of course. What is the story you've brought to the table?
Right. So this is the news that hedge funds see better returns when they're controlled by someone other than a white man. And this is according to new data out this week from Bloomberg, which analyzed something like 3,000 funds.
Well, hold on. It did analyse something like 3,000 funds and found 35 controlled by women and non-white people, which is a story in itself, and we'll talk about that. But it is a very tiny sample, isn't it? To conclude, therefore, that women and ethnic minority managers do better at investments.
Sure, yeah. I mean, this particular sample is relatively small, but it is not the first or the only example of this. So this is something that's been found repeatedly over time. And particularly what pops up over and over again is actually that women specifically are better investors than men. And that's actually where most of the data on this is. It talks about, I mean, we've known for a long time that companies that are run by a more diverse board or have diversity at the top, they bring in more revenue, more profit. So what's interesting about this in particular is by how much these hedge funds outperform. And it's more than double over 3 years. And again, this has been shown over and over again. The problem, though, of course, is that women and minorities are vastly underrepresented in the finance world in 2018.
So, and that's, I guess, what I was getting at with my question before, is does this indicate that to be a woman or someone from an ethnic minority at the very top of a big company means you are exceptional in the first place because of the ingrained discrimination that there is for you to get to the top and the competition from white men?
Yes.
And therefore, maybe it's not a representative sample of your gender or your skin colour.
Oh, yeah. I think there's probably something to be said for that. And I also think there's a lot to be said for the hurdles that you have to face as someone who isn't a white man trying to get into investing. It's a predominantly male industry. There are huge hurdles that women and people of color face. You know, the question is, like, if we know this to be true, if in times of both growth and crisis, the funds that do better are run by a more diverse leadership, as people who are investing and want to see their money grow, why isn't there more demand for diversity at the top?
Would a reasonable response to this statistic, Arian, to be to say, right, I want to say to your pension manager, if you're listening to this, and you put £100 a month into your pension, to say to them, I only want to invest in funds run by women?
Yes, you could try to draw that as your conclusion? The information that we've got is that some funds perform better than others. And the conclusion that has been drawn by these articles is that it's to do with the fact that they're run by women or ethnic minorities. But it seems to me that that is by the by, particularly on the gender issue. I think that a lot of the stuff that you then see being extrapolated from this is, well, why do women perform better as investors and fund managers? And then you start to head into that territory of pop psychological explanation of, well, women are better at multitasking and men are better at mathematics, and somehow this is more of that than of that.
You seem critical of that approach, but hey, let's do that. Why are women better investors, Jess?
There are a number of reasons that have been proposed and sort of anecdotally as well. People have suggested that one of the reasons is that women are more risk averse, so they're less likely to make hugely risky investments. They favor sort of slow and steady investments rather than like very volatile, get rich quick stocks. They're also sort of in it for the long haul, so instead of looking for an immediate return, they wait it out, but at the same time, they know when to let go of something that isn't working, so they're willing to say, okay, this isn't working, so I'm gonna cut my losses and go, whereas men apparently tend to hold on to a losing investment hoping that they'll improve.
But then wouldn't that point, Gabriel, to the conclusion that women make the best mediocre investors? Like the worst will be the men who gamble badly, and the best would be the men who gamble best, who make the best decision, make a reckless decision, but it works for them if the women aren't making those decisions.
There is probably a lot of truth in that argument. But a 2012 paper that I found said that this line of thinking about women being risk averse and thus it helping with investments actually overstates the effect that has on investments, and it overstates how much of an effect it has on people's lives generally, the risk aversion, and also how big the difference is between men and women. I mean, risk aversion is such a hard thing to qualify and quantify. It's kind of hard to apply it to such a quantifiable system like finance and investments.
Okay, I'm glad we went there. So anyway, Arian, that was the conversation you didn't want us to have. What was the point you were trying to make?
Thank you.
So that's
for
all nonsense.
Interrupting me mid-rant.
And what?
Well, so basically, I reject the premise of that stuff about women's brains being wired differently, at least at some sort of scientific level. Maybe you could sort of say that through whatever societal business goes on, leads female investors to have these sorts of qualities. But then we're talking about a style of investment being more successful, and not the person, and certainly not the gender who is behind the use of that style of investment. So if it turns out that the cautious approach to investment is by and large a better one, then that's what we should be looking at. And actually I had a quick chat with our resident financial guru, John Stepek, before this, and that was his kind of point. He said that hedge funds in themselves are kind of often selling snake oil, and a lot of hedge funds underperform versus just straight up investing in the market itself. So actually slow and steady is a more beneficial way to invest usually than the more sort of active investment that hedge funds tend to do.
And that is often the sort of unsexy conclusion of reading through the financial pages, isn't it, Jess? It's basically like if you're going to make a long-term bet, 20 years or whatever, you are better off investing in Unilever and Coca-Cola than you are doing something that feels risky and feels exciting enough at the moment, because obviously the flip side of that is it might not work.
Yeah, I mean, the point is true that hedge funds just generally, like, they have to be aggressive. That's what makes them different from, mutual funds or whatever. I think the broader point that I want to make, though, is just reminding people how few women and minorities are in this world in general.
Yeah.
And also how few women invest and what that means for us. So a study by YouGov found that 55% of UK women said that they have never held an investment, and that's compared to 37% of men. Why aren't women throwing their money into the market? This is a huge investment for their future. Is it because they don't see other women doing it? Are they underrepresented generally, and that discourages us from taking a risk? And there's never going to be change until there are more women and people of color at the top of these industries.
So is it incumbent on people listening to this who work in those kinds of industries, hedge funds, etc., to go out looking for women to work with them? Because it seems like actually women don't apply in the same numbers as men in the first place.
Yes, I do think we need to be proactive. And also it's undeniable that women face sexism in that when they do try and start a hedge fund, the bar is much higher for them. So it's harder for them to get funding because people don't trust them. There's just inherent sexism there. So it's more difficult for them to get the funding they need. And so, I think it's being willing to say, I'm going to trust this person regardless of their gender with my money, and I trust their ability to take risks and their ability to judge the market, and I'm going to give them my money.
Isn't the danger of this story that it has traction and we all find it interesting because it leads to that point about this indicates how few women there are at the top and we need to talk about that? But had the findings been different, had the findings been, well, it turns out that white men are the best hedge fund managers, and therefore the conclusion of that is don't employ women or people of colour, that would be something that we would all steer away from discussing and would consider actually probably reductionist, borderline racist and sexist, right? So why, when it goes in a sort of liberal direction, is it okay to talk about statistics as if gender's the main factor here?
And I think that's why I object to this, that if we're looking for the best techniques and approaches for investment, which we absolutely should be if we're going to think about investing ourselves, then why assign it to a gender or an ethnicity at all? We should be looking at the things that the successful investors do and trying to apply that more broadly to our own approach to investment.
So Jess, having read up on all this, are you going to make more investments yourself? Are you naturally an investor?
I do invest. I would like to get better at investing. And if you want me to do any investing for you, just let me know.
Okay, we'll have words afterwards. Arian's up next after this. And finally this week, it's Arian. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week we found out that just a spoonful of sugar could help the medicine use go down.
Over the last 30 years, placebo experts and neuropsychologists have shown that placebos don't just work by making us say we feel better. They produce a whole host of specific neurobiological effects. I could spend all day talking to you about placebo effects. But while those studies are provocative, intriguing, the more useful question is not, is there a placebo effect? But what can we do as patients, as providers, to consciously, deliberately harness that effect to our advantage?
A clip from TED Med, Harnessing the Power of Placebos, from the Stanford professor, athlete and psychologist Alia Crum, available to stream online. Arian, what was she talking about?
She was talking about how placebos are more effective at treating illness than some people had previously thought. But the news this week, which I think is utterly fascinating and a little bit underreported, is that not only are placebos, which are non-medicalized treatments, a sort of sugar pill that you give someone in lieu of an actual pill, that not only are they effective in treating a whole range of different types of ailment, but they can also work, and this is what we previously didn't know, when you tell someone, this is a placebo, I'm giving you sugar, if you take it, it will have no effect. And yet, according to the latest research, it's found to actually have positive medical effects on people.
Wow. Says who?
Says a growing body of evidence based on a whole range of different research projects that have been compiled together by the Wall Street Journal.
What kind of illnesses are people responding to placebos with? I mean, are these things that are sort of obviously partly psychological, or are they, cancer?
That's the fascinating thing, and the stuff that these studies in particular were addressing was pain specifically. So these were drugs that were given to people, or actually non-drugs that were given to people to treat their ongoing pains. And the ones that placebos particularly seemed to work with were cancer-related fatigue, the symptoms of irritable bowel syndrome, and chronic back pain. And chronic back pain is an absolutely fascinating subject that so happens was also under scrutiny this week in another really interesting article by The Economist called Back to Basics was their headline, where they were looking at how big a problem back pain is worldwide. It's actually one of the leading disabilities in terms of the number of years people live with it as an ailment around the world. And it's something that we really don't understand. And a lot of the kinds of treatments that have historically been used to treat back pain and chronic pain generally have been found to be really ineffective, and especially stuff like the opioids that started to be prescribed in the US and elsewhere, but also basically all of our pain relief for chronic pains seems to have been going wrong. And that's where, if it turns out this is right and placebos could be effective, this just seems like a really interesting development.
But it also seems like an absolutely mental thing to study to do, doesn't it, Jess? I mean, if you're a doctor and you've gone through 6 years of university or whatever to become a doctor and to become medically trained, imagine the lesson where they tell you, right, here's the thing. Someone comes to you with 10 years worth of chronic back pain or cancer-related fatigue, and the answer is you say to them, there's nothing I can do, but I'm going to give you an ineffective pill, and that will help you, and I've got the science to prove it. I mean, I just can't imagine wanting to put that into practice, even if the science said it was the case.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of crazy, isn't it? It sort of demonstrates the sheer power of the brain. The statistic that I found fascinating was that like 30 to 50% of people with chronic pain can respond to placebos. You know, previously, obviously, it is not ethical to give someone a placebo without telling them. And so it's amazing that you can say, okay, we're going to tell you that this doesn't work, and it's going to work. It seems sort of contradictory. I also found it really interesting the way they talk about that it's not just taking a pill. It's also the sort of process that you go through as a patient to see a doctor, explain your symptoms, be in a medical setting. It seems to be very, very in the brain, giving the brain signals that suggest you are in a comforting environment, you are being listened to, you are being heard, you're being helped. It's really interesting. And also they're looking at signals in the brain. There's research that suggests that some brains could have a certain signature that tells people, doctors in particular, this person would be receptive to a placebo effect. So it's not everybody, but they might be able to someday look into our brains and say, you are more susceptible to convincing yourself that this could work.
But also different countries have different setups, don't they, medically? So, Gabriel, you could sort of imagine that the NHS would be quite pleased if, you know, a policy came along for a medicine that didn't cost very much. But in the USA, for example, where health insurance is the way that people get their medical treatment, there's a whole industry based around certain treatments, certain surgeries, certain pills being dispensed.
What I think links into that I found the most amazing thing about this whole concept is the fact that one of the studies was published in December in the journal Pain by a group of German researchers who divided 120...
I'm a big subscriber. Never miss an issue of Pain.
So good, that's a page turner. They divided 122 chronic back pain patients into two groups, one of whom they gave the placebo and said, we're giving you a placebo, and the other not just did nothing, but they continued their actual back pain treatment. So it's not like it was a placebo versus a control that was no medicine at all. It was a placebo versus actual back medicine. The placebo users reported a significantly higher reduction in pain, despite the fact that any medical scans or whatever on their backs showed no difference whatsoever. And that, to me, is just, it's bizarre that it can beat out actual medicine that exists and that we've... I mean, it's the same, as Jess was saying, about being in a comforting environment. It's the same kind of concept as homeopathy. It's why that became a thing 200-odd years ago.
No, and is still a thing now. In fact, a story that you brought to the table on this podcast last summer, Arian, in a very disparaging way, discussing whether or not any government should back homeopathy, because there was a controversy about that in France. And I mean, I was really struggling to be devil's advocate in that conversation because everyone on the show was basically saying, homeopathy is nonsense. But I mean, if placebo effect provably isn't, then why not homeopathy too?
Well, sure. But the problem with homeopathy, and the reason why I think we were turning our noses up at it, is that it's claiming to be medical in a way that it's probably not really medical. If you accept homeopathy as a placebo, which I would say zero homeopathy practitioners would, then I think it could be a really valid and useful practice. But if you're trying to apply the reasoning behind a homeopathic pill as the reason why you are getting better from something, then I think it doesn't work.
Jess, I know you're concerned about the downsides to this research.
Yeah, I mean, I found this so interesting, and I think there are a lot of potential avenues for improving healthcare and pain management. I also worry about the possibility of it sort of backfiring and relying too heavily on sort of the power of the brain to heal your pain. Overprescribing is certainly a problem, but so is underprescribing and underdiagnosing. And I think that for a long time there are a number of ailments that people have suffered from for years, and doctors thought that they weren't real. They thought they were all in their head. So like chronic fatigue syndrome has only recently become something that's been medically recognized as to be a real problem. And for a long time, people were suffering from that for years and not being taken seriously. Similarly, I think women for a long time have had their various ailments ignored and been told this this is all in your head. This is just something that's not real. And so I think we have to be a little bit careful when we wade into waters of how much you and your brain control your physical pain.
But that's only to suggest that it's not real if it's in your head. I mean, what the conclusion is that clearly the brain has real power over the way we feel. So it's not to minimize it. It's just to say there isn't a physical reason necessarily beyond what's in your brain, and that is important. That is treatable.
Sure, but if you think about, let's say, like the NHS, for example, that wants to cut costs, if they see an opportunity to say, you do not need these drugs, they might take it. Similarly, I was working on a story a few years back about a woman who gave birth in an American hospital and was in quite a lot of pain afterwards. And the doctors would not give her high-level prescription painkillers because of the opioid epidemic, and because they said, you don't need this, it'll go away. They gave her ibuprofen or whatever instead. So I think if we give certain medical professionals the opportunity and the incentive even not to prescribe drugs, there's something to be careful about there.
And actually, I had a run-in with the NHS where it really felt like that exact thing was what they were trying to do. I had chronic back pain flare-up.
You're a tall man. I think that's relevant for listeners.
And I think that does contribute to my susceptibility to it, as it turns out, after having gone through lots of treatment. But in the moment that it happened, it was an intense pain, and I called 111 thinking that it probably wasn't a 999 type emergency situation. But in getting to 111, honestly, their line of questioning was like, are you bleeding from every orifice, and have any of your limbs fallen off? And if the answer to those questions is no, they really just said, just go see your doctor on Monday. Jess, you're right, that that's kind of the risk in not treating things that are otherwise serious. It so happens that it probably isn't the case with back pain, which probably does need to be treated in non-medical ways. And that was the conclusion of this fascinating Economist feature, that really all of the techniques that we currently have for treating back pain are not working. And there's this massive industry that is keeping alive spinal fusions and opioids and the kind of prescriptions for this problem that we currently have. But actually, some rebalancing. Yes, we don't want to go too far in the other direction, but some hitting of a middle ground does seem to be the most sensible path to go with this.
I should say, for anyone who's listening to this and is currently on a waiting list for spinal surgery, when we say not working, we mean not working perhaps as best they might. I mean, obviously some people do have surgery and see an improvement, right? We don't want to be disheartening about this.
That's true. Yes, there are statistics, but again, well worth reading the Economist piece, because it's quite low compared to the number of people who are undergoing the surgery, and also, at least according to this feature, and I'm not a doctor, so if you're getting spinal surgery, seek a second opinion here. But at least according to that, it was saying that there is an overdiagnosis of the kinds of problems that can be fixed by that sort of surgery.
And with that, we've reached the end of this edition of The Week Unwrapped. It wasn't all in your head. My thanks to Aaron McNichol, Jessica Hullinger, and Gabriel Power. Remember to subscribe to the show. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. It will not cure your back problems, but it will sometimes put a smile on your face. I've been Ollie Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sarah Miles at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to Unwrap next week, bye-bye.